The humidity hit like a wall the moment you stepped outside, the kind that made your uniform cling to your back within minutes and turned the simplest task into an endurance test. Staff Sergeant Elena Ruiz stood at the edge of the jungle training range, methodically checking her rifle for the third time, running through the same pre-combat checks she'd performed hundreds of times before. Around her, soldiers from both the U.S. Army and the Philippine military moved into position for the live-fire exercise, their voices carrying across the clearing in a mix of English and Tagalog. "Hey, check it out." The voice came from behind her, loud enough to be heard but pretending not to be. Specialist Jake Morrison, all 6'2" of him, grinned at the private beside him. "Sarge is doing her safety dance again. Third time's the charm, right?" The private snickered, trying to keep it quiet but failing. Elena didn't turn around. She finished her check, moved to inspect the comms equipment, her face a carefully maintained blank. "I'm just saying," Morrison continued, his voice rising with that particular confidence of someone who'd never had to question his place. "Some people gotta work real hard to look the part, you know? Army's got quotas to fill. Gotta have that diversity box checked." The words landed exactly where they were meant to. Elena's jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second before smoothing out again. She picked up the radio handset, tested the connection to headquarters, her movements precise and professional. Around her, the rest of the squad exchanged glances, smirks passing between them like a shared secret. Even Sergeant First Class Davis, who should have shut it down, just shook his head with a small smile and turned away. One of the Filipino Marines, a compact man with alert eyes and sun-weathered skin, watched the exchange with growing discomfort. He'd seen enough joint operations to read the dynamics, and what he was seeing now made him uneasy. The American female sergeant was being disrespected openly, and no one was stepping in. "Listen up," Elena called out, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Before we step off, let's review casualty evacuation procedures one more time. If someone goes down—" "Jesus, Sarge, we got it," Morrison interrupted, rolling his eyes theatrically for his audience. "We know how to drag someone to cover. This ain't our first rodeo. It's your first live-fire jungle drill," Elena said evenly. "The terrain's different, and it's your first time running one," another soldier chimed in. "So maybe we're all learning together." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, exactly. It was dismissive, which somehow felt worse. Elena stood there, 5'5" in her boots, weathered pack on her shoulders, and absorbed it. She'd learned early that fighting back in these moments only confirmed what they already believed, that she was too sensitive, too emotional, trying too hard to prove something. So she went quiet instead, nodded once, and turned to face the tree line. But her eyes weren't casual. They scanned the jungle with the kind of focus that didn't match someone just pretending, tracking sight lines and natural cover, mentally mapping distances and angles with an intensity that came from somewhere deeper than classroom training. If any of them had been paying attention, they might have noticed. But they were too busy laughing as they moved toward the range, Morrison making exaggerated marching motions that sent another ripple of amusement through the group. Elena watched them go, that flat expression never wavering, and something old and heavy settled in her chest. This wasn't new. This was a pattern she knew too well. The past lived in fragments, sharp and immediate when it surfaced. Years ago, in a country that felt like another lifetime, Elena had been a young sergeant running convoy security through Iraq's most volatile corridors. The memories came in flashes, dust so thick you could taste copper, blown out overpasses creating natural ambush points, the constant low-grade tension that made your shoulders ache by the end of every mission. One particular mission refused to fade. They'd been moving between logistics hubs, 3 MRAPs in formation, when a world suddenly inverted. The IED blast lifted the lead vehicle like a toy, flipping it onto its side in a screaming cascade of metal and fire. Elena had been in the second truck, her ears ringing from the concussion, and through the chaos she'd heard the screaming. She'd moved without thinking, dropping out of the vehicle while rounds started cracking from nearby buildings. Incoming fire, searching for targets. The gunner from the lead truck was trapped, his leg pinned, flames licking up from a ruptured fuel line. Another soldier was crawling away, blood streaming from a head wound, shock making his movements uncoordinated. Elena had crawled under fire. That part was clear in her memory. The burn of hot sand through her gloves, the sound of bullets impacting near her head, the horrible understanding that she might not make it. But she'd reached the gunner first, leveraging her body against the wreckage to pull him free, then dragging him 20 meters to cover while suppressive fire from her team kept enemy heads down. She'd gone back for the second soldier, hands slipping in blood, her voice hoarse from shouting instructions. The radio calls came next, her voice somehow steady as she called in the 9-line medevac, transmitted grid coordinates, updated the quick reaction force on the tactical situation. She'd organized fields of fire, coordinated with the other trucks, kept everyone moving while smoke poured from the wreck and the world tried to tear itself apart. Hours later, sitting in a TOC with the adrenaline finally draining away, she'd stared at her hands. They were still shaking, still covered in dried blood that wasn't hers. Someone had handed her a burn name tape recovered from the wreck. A soldier who hadn't made it, whose body they'd pulled from the fire after the fighting stopped. Elena had folded it carefully and tucked it into her wallet, where it still lived years later. There'd been an award, she supposed. A citation for Valor that got filed somewhere in her record. But what she remembered most was the weight, the understanding that the difference between life and death could come down to training, discipline, and the ability to move when every instinct screamed to freeze. That experience had made her valuable to the Army, eventually landing her in this advisor-type unit, sent to the Philippines to help run joint exercises with partner forces. It was supposed to be her expertise, complex operations, partner coordination, managing chaos. But to her current squad, most of them garrison soldiers with maybe a Kuwait deployment between them, she was just another NCO. Shorter than most, quieter than expected, trying to fit in. They couldn't see the steel underneath, and she'd stopped trying to show them. The days at the jungle camp blurred together in a rhythm of heat, rain, and routine. Morning PT in the pre-dawn darkness, weapons cleaning under tin roofs while monsoonal rain drummed overhead, briefings that stretched on while everyone sweated through their uniforms. Through it all, the disrespect grew in small, insidious ways. Morrison perfected his imitation of her serious tone, dropping his voice and squaring his shoulders whenever she gave instructions. Check your sectors. He'd mimic after she walked away, and the others would laugh. When Elena insisted on rehearsing casualty evacuation routes for the third time, eyes rolled in unison. PowerPoint warrior, someone muttered, just loud enough to hear. Probably spent her whole deployment in an air-conditioned office. The squad-level planning huddle happened without her. Not maliciously, exactly, they just forgot to loop her in, having the discussion while she was checking equipment. When she arrived late and asked about the plan, Davis shrugged. Just going over the basics. Nothing you don't already know. The silence was the worst part. Davis, as the senior sergeant, could have shut it down with a word. Instead, he let it ride, his inaction giving permission for the mockery to grow. It was the kind of institutional indifference Elena recognized from a dozen previous assignments. Nobody had to actively hate her for her to be systematically undermined. But there were cracks in the facade if anyone cared to look. Elena's ruck was packed with a medic's precision, trauma supplies organized in a way that spoke to muscle memory and experience. When a Filipino Marine mentioned a remote coastal village during a briefing, Elena had instinctively asked about a nearby choke point, surprising him by knowing the local threat patterns and previous incidents in detail. During a training exercise with simulated IEDs, one of the training charges went off unexpectedly close. Elena had dropped before her brain could process the sound, her body hitting the dirt in a reaction too fast to be practiced, too visceral to be fake. She'd recovered quickly, laughing it off as the others grinned at her overreaction, but her hands had shaken for 10 minutes afterward. The rumors started circulating like poison through still water. She'd padded her record to get the assignment. She talked a good game to her superiors, but couldn't back it up. She was trying to prove something, compensating for being in over her head. Each small cut wasn't enough to trigger formal action, But together they built an environment where Elena was both isolated and constantly on trial. Every morning she had to earn basic respect all over again, and every evening she lost ground. The Filipino troops noticed but stayed quiet, their cultural norms keeping them from interfering in American unit dynamics. Elena absorbed it all with that same flat expression, choosing silence over confrontation, and the squad mistook her patience for weakness. They were about to learn the difference. The convoy was supposed to be routine, a movement to a remote training site higher in the mountains where they'd practice partner patrols and small unit tactics. 3 vehicles, mixed U.S. and Philippine forces, a 2-hour drive through winding jungle roads. Elena had spent the previous evening reviewing intelligence updates, noting fresh reports of extremist activity near one of the villages along their planned route. She'd brought it up at the morning brief. I recommend we take Highway 7 instead of the direct route through Barangay San Miguel. Latest reports show. It's an exercise, Sarge, Davis had interrupted, not unkindly, but with finality. We're fine. The indirect route adds 90 minutes. We're not going to make our link-up time. Morrison had snorted, always worried about something. Probably sees terrorists in her sleep. They'd taken the direct route. Elena had climbed into the second vehicle without another word, her jaw set, knowing that pushing harder would only reinforce their image of her as overly cautious, too nervous, not cut out for the job. The narrow mountain road wound through dense jungle, the canopy overhead creating a tunnel of green. It was beautiful in a claustrophobic way, the kind of terrain that made commanders nervous and made ambushes effective. Elena sat in the passenger seat, her rifle across her lap, scanning the tree line with that same focus from the training range days before. The IED caught them in the worst possible spot, a hairpin turn where the road narrowed, jungle pressing in from both sides, no room to maneuver. The lead vehicle had just completed the turn when the blast hit, the explosion tearing through the front wheel well and flipping the truck sideways. For one frozen moment, the convoy sat in shocked silence. Then the tree line erupted with gunfire. Rounds cracked through the air, impacting against vehicle armor, shattering windows. Morrison started firing, his weapon on full automatic, burning through a magazine in seconds without identifying targets. Davis shouted something, but 2 other voices shouted over him, creating chaos on the radio net. A Filipino soldier returned fire, more disciplined, but confusion rippled through both forces. Elena took a knee behind the engine block, her mind cutting through the noise with brutal clarity. She'd been here before. Different continent, different uniform, same fundamental chaos of an ambush breaking over unprepared soldiers. Cease fire. Cease fire. Her voice cut through the panic, commands Sergeant Hard. Dragon 6, this is Dragon 2-6. Contact, contact, contact. Grid 847,392. Enemy in the tree line, east side of the road. Estimate squad-sized element. 1 vehicle mobility kill, assessing casualties. Morrison was still firing wildly. Elena grabbed his shoulder, her grip iron. Specialist, controlled pairs. Identify your target before you shoot. You're wasting ammunition. To her left, Davis had taken a round through the shoulder and was slumped against the vehicle, his face pale. Elena pulled him back behind cover, her hands already reaching for her aid bag. Tourniquet first, the cloth wrapping tight above the wound, twisted until the bleeding slowed. Davis groaned, teeth clenched, but she was already moving to the next problem. Filipino forces, this is Staff Sergeant Ruiz. We need your element to establish security on the west side, prevent enemy flanking movement. Acknowledge. The Filipino captain's voice came back, strained but steady. Acknowledged. Moving now. Elena keyed the radio again, her voice dropping into the clipped, formal cadence of a 9-line medevac request. Dragon 6, be advised. 1 urgent casualty, gunshot wound to shoulder. Preparing collection point. Requesting air support and QRF to current location. The voice on the other end came back uncertain. Dragon 2-6, we have you marked as conducting a training exercise. Confirm this is real world. Affirmative, this is real world. I say again, real-world enemy contact. We're taking effective fire. Reference previous intelligence reports on extremist activity near Barangay San Miguel. She rattled off specific details from the report she'd read. Recent incidents, known threat groups, the exact warnings that had been ignored. Her precision and specificity cut through headquarters hesitation. Solid copy. QRF is spinning up. Air support inbound. ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes. An eternity in a firefight. Elena ran the calculations in her head. Ammunition, casualties, tactical position. The ambush was well planned, but not perfectly executed. They'd expected a softer target. The extremists were firing from concealment, but not maneuvering aggressively. Listen up, Elena called out, projecting over the gunfire. We're moving to that ravine, 30 meters south. It gives us cover and better sight lines. We're going to bound back in teams. Filipino forces cover first movement, then we cover your movement. On my mark. She organized them in teams, designated a casualty collection point in the ravine, and started the movement. It wasn't graceful, but it was controlled. Soldiers who'd been panicking 5 minutes earlier now moved with purpose, following her directions because they were clear and because, in this moment, she was the only thing between them and chaos. Morrison's weapon jammed mid-movement, and Elena watched his face go white with panic. She moved to him, her voice dropping calm. Tap, rack, assess. You know the drill. Mortar out, the malfunction. I've got security. His hand shook, but he followed the steps, cleared the jam, and looked at her with something like recognition for the first time. She pointed out targets, guided his fire, and moved on to the next problem. The fight lasted 18 minutes before the enemy disengaged, melting back into the jungle as the sound of helicopter rotors grew louder. The QRF arrived to find a controlled defensive position, casualties stabilized, ammunition counted and redistributed, security established. The contrast was stark. What had started as chaos had been hammered into something functional, and every soldier there knew who'd done the hammering. Elena sat against a tree as the Filipino captain approached, his expression thoughtful. You have done this before, he said quietly. Many times, I think. She didn't answer, just nodded once, and went back to checking her rifle. The makeshift debrief area was a cleared section of the camp, plastic chairs arranged in rough rows, ceiling fans doing little against the heat. The squad sat mud-streaked and exhausted, the earlier cocky energy completely gone. Davis had been medevaced to a field hospital, stable, but out of action. Morrison sat on a bench, staring at his hands, still processing how close he'd come to falling apart completely. The investigating officer arrived with a lieutenant colonel from the Joint Task Force, both men carrying folders and wearing expressions of professional concern. The colonel was older, his uniform showing the patches of multiple combat deployments, and he ran through the incident with methodical precision. Who established radio contact with headquarters? He asked. Multiple heads turned toward Elena. Who organized the casualty collection point and initiated the medevac request? Elena again. Who coordinated with the Filipino forces for the tactical movement to the ravine? The Filipino captain spoke up, his English careful but firm. Staff Sergeant Ruiz led the response. She led like she had done this many times before. Very professional. Very calm. The colonel studied Elena for a long moment, then opened her service record. The room went quiet as he flipped through pages, his expression shifting from professional interest to recognition. Staff Sergeant Elena Ruiz, he read aloud. Iraq deployment, 2018 to 2019. Convoy security operations. He paused, his finger stopping on a particular page. Bronze Star with Valor. Army Commendation Medal with Valor. Combat Action Badge. Another pause. Sustained casualty evacuation under fire near Mosul. Rescued 2 soldiers from a burning vehicle while under enemy fire. Coordinated QRF response. Established casualty collection point. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Morrison's face had gone carefully blank. The other soldiers who'd spent weeks mocking her careful preparations, her serious tone, her overreactions, now sat with the reality of how catastrophically wrong they'd been. The colonel didn't humiliate them. He simply stated the facts with military precision. The squad survived today because one NCO recognized the threat, took it seriously, and had the experience to act under pressure. That's what training and combat experience look like. Take notes. He closed the folder, stood, and gave Elena a slight nod before leaving. The investigating officer asked a few more questions, documented responses, and departed. The squad was left sitting in the humid afternoon, the weight of recognition settling over them like a physical presence. The days that followed were different in ways both obvious and subtle. Morrison didn't deliver a dramatic apology. Instead, he found Elena one evening while she was cleaning her rifle and asked, quietly, if she could show him how to properly set up his med kit for next time. He actually listened, taking notes, asking follow-up questions. Davis, back from the hospital with his arm in a sling, started including her in planning discussions by default, not as a courtesy, but as standard operating procedure. Her input was no longer optional, it was expected. The casual disrespect didn't vanish entirely, old habits died hard, but it was checked now, corrected, no longer given space to breathe. The Filipino troops treated her with obvious respect, which created its own subtle pressure on the American soldiers. It was hard to maintain casual mockery when your host nation partners deferred to someone with quiet professionalism. One evening, Elena sat alone on a bench overlooking the jungle, the sun setting through the canopy in shafts of gold and shadow. She pulled the burn name tape from her wallet, the fabric rough against her fingertips, the letters still barely visible. She wasn't thinking about vindication. She was thinking about the soldiers who never got this second life, who'd burned in wrecks or bled out on dusty roads, whose families had folded flags and buried pieces of their hearts. The steel everyone had finally seen in her wasn't something she was proud of, not exactly. It was just what remained after everything else burned away. The fear, the doubt, the need for approval. What they'd witnessed in the ambush wasn't her being exceptional. It was her being exactly what she'd been forged into, in places most of them would never have to see. The squad filed past her bench on their way to the mess hall. Morrison gave her a small nod. Another soldier, one who'd laughed the loudest that first day on the range, said, "Evening, Sergeant," with something approximating respect. The Filipino captain paused, offered a genuine smile, and continued on. Elena folded the name tape carefully and tucked it back into her wallet. She stood, shouldered her rifle, and walked toward the mess hall. Tomorrow they'd train again, run more drills, prepare for scenarios that might never come, but had to be ready for anyway. The weight of her experience would remain invisible to most people, hidden under a plain uniform and a quiet demeanor. But her squad knew now. They'd learned the hard way what so many people never understand, that the hardest steel is often hidden where no one thinks to look, and that silence is never the same thing as weakness. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who's already survived everything you can imagine, and is choosing, with great discipline, not to show you the scars unless you force the issue. The jungle pressed in around the camp as darkness fell, cicadas beginning their nightly chorus. Elena walked with the same economical stride she'd had from the beginning. Nothing about her external appearance changed. But the space around her was different now. A small bubble of earned respect, hard-won and fragile, that would require daily maintenance to preserve. She'd learned long ago that respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned in moments that mattered, when bullets flew and people needed someone to make the chaos make sense. She'd earned it again, at a cost she'd never discuss with anyone who hadn't been there. And tomorrow, she'd wake up and do it all over again, because that's what the uniform required, and that's what the names in her wallet deserved.